This recording is going to cover antecedent strategies. Before you listen or before you watch or listen to this video, read the chapter from the Scott book. That is one of the readings in the reading folder for Unit 2, and that talks about antecedent strategies. Antecedent strategies are two proactive strategies that we just talked about. The difference is that proactive strategies are things that apply to the entire classroom. In other words, they are the things that you do for the entire room to create an effective environment. Antecedent strategies could apply to more than one student, but we're beginning now to focus on individual students with behavioral issues. So there's a lot of similarity between proactive interventions and antecedent strategies, but just think of antecedent strategies as being a little bit more focused. They're also called predictor strategies because later on when we start talking about functional behavior assessment, we're going to talk about performing an assessment to determine the predictors of problem behavior, or the antecedents of problem behavior. Antecedent strategies are things that we do to change those predictors so that it's less likely our student is going to have a problem to begin. So the purpose is they're things that we implement before a behavior occurs, and they reduce the likelihood of us having a problem. They're based on assessment information. So we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit because these are interventions that we will develop usually after we do a functional behavior assessment, and we haven't talked about that yet, but suffice it to say that we do one first, and it makes sense to me to talk about it along with proactive strategies. Just like the proactive strategies, we're talking about being proactive or getting ahead of things rather than being reactive. You never want to get into a reactive situation with a student who has behavioral difficulties, because really what's happening, if that does occur, is the student's calling the shots. If a student is engaging in a problem behavior to get the teacher's attention, and the teacher consistently reacts to that problem behavior, the student is calling the shots. The teacher is simply reinforcing the behavior and making it worse over time. To avoid that, it's important to know how to assess or determine why a problem behavior occurs. Then you're in a better position to develop interventions to deal with it. You can implement antecedent strategies when problem behaviors are not occurring. You know, the difference between a really effective teacher and one that is less effective, effective teachers are always ahead of the game. It's not what you do just after a problem occurs that determines whether or not you're effective. It's what you do when the problems aren't occurring. That's when 95% of effective instruction takes place. It's when most of the interventions around challenging behavior take place, at times when the behavior isn't actually occurring. It gives you more control of teaching opportunities if you use antecedent strategies. You are designing learning situations for your students to practice appropriate behavior. We'll talk in the next unit about alternative behaviors, teaching alternative behaviors. Antecedent strategies may involve interventions that allow students to practice more appropriate ways of behaving to get their needs met. We're going to talk in the next unit also about functional relationships. When you have something in the environment that occurs that predicts a problem behavior, and when the problem behavior reliably gets a reaction from someone, either in the form of attention or sometimes a behavior serves as a way to escape or avoid a situation, when you have a clear relationship between factors in the environment and a behavior problem, that's called a functional relationship. Antecedent strategies can disrupt that relationship. By changing the predictors of problem behavior, we can make it occur less often. When it occurs less often, that gives us more opportunities to teach students more appropriate ways of behaving. And it's certainly less disruptive on the environment than other kinds of interventions. Effective antecedent strategies are things that are pretty easily integrated into the classroom. Sometimes we'll talk about situations where we really don't know what the function of a behavior is. It does happen. I've worked with kids over the years that I really wasn't able to get a clear understanding of why they engaged in a particular behavior. One of the strengths of antecedent strategies, we can use them and they can be effective even when we don't clearly know the function of a behavior. It's also something that fits in well with the model we're using. Remember, one of the previous presentations we talked about the model of positive behavior support. When problems are occurring, first you look at the overall structure of the classroom, and then you fix those things. If you still have problems, then you start looking at more individualized assessment strategies. We're beginning to talk more now about those individualized assessment strategies. Sometimes the antecedents or things that might trigger a problem behavior might be environmental factors like noise. It might be a particular person. Or usually what it is the way that a person is interacting with a student. With kids with emotional and behavioral disorders, it could be the way that we deliver demands or instruction. It could be certain kinds of activities, certain kinds of instructional activities. It could be a number of things. But again, once I've identified them, we can make some changes to those things to make it less likely that a problem occurs. Some of the first variables we want to look at are curricular variables. Does the instruction the student's receiving fit the needs of that student? There are a number of things that we look at. First of all, is the activity or is the instructional task functional for that person? In other words, is this a skill that's useful to that person? Is it something that is going to lead to this person being more independent? Even students with very severe disabilities are aware if they're doing something that serves no purpose. So sometimes that can be the cause of a problem behavior. Is the activity age appropriate? Is it something similar to what you would expect from non-disabled peers? Is it a preferred task or preferred activity? Well, certainly students sometimes are going to be in situations where they have to complete activities or assignments that are not highly preferred, but there are things we can do that we'll talk about later on. One of them might be scheduling creatively so that you're alternating more and less preferred activities. Another might be embedding something into a routine that's more highly preferred. The length of the task is a factor. Is it simply too long? If it's a less preferred activity, are we asking the student to do it too long? Would shortening the task or dividing it up into segments help? And is the difficulty too great? Does the instruction need to be modified for this student? Or do we need to go back and teach some prerequisite skills to this student? If we're asking the student to perform a mathematical operation, does the student have the prerequisite skills needed to complete that task? Or do we need to teach a strategy? Do we need to teach this person a sequence of steps to go through to solve a particular kind of problem? Or do we need to provide some kind of adaptation? Do we need to simply make the task easier? Sometimes antecedent strategies involve giving the student a different way to respond. I was working recently with a student with Asperger's syndrome, and he had a lot of difficulty with handwriting. If he was able to keyboard some of his responses, that avoided a lot of frustration. A lot of schools that are able to obtain them are using iPads for some students. Those can be pretty handy, but you don't have to have something that expensive. Some of the keyboard devices are pretty inexpensive. or even the person with Asperger's syndrome was using a very old computer, but it met his needs and it was functional. Sometimes if the response is pretty open-ended for some students, maybe giving a series of choices might be a good alternative. In other words, instead of just coming up with an answer out of the blue, they could be given 5 or 6 choices to choose from. It needs to be adapted to the individual student, obviously, but look at the way you're asking the student to respond. Consider if a different way of responding to teacher requests or a different way to responding to academic tasks would make that task less aversive for that student. That's really what we're talking about here, is can we change some element of the instruction to make it less aversive? Something like that if the student is engaging in a behavior to escape something. There's a concept that's called non-contingent reinforcement. We've talked about reinforcement somewhat already, and seems a little weird that I'm saying use it non-contingently. Well, the idea here is if you know what a student's after, let's say a student's after your attention, you're the teacher, and if you give the student your attention on a very frequent schedule, then it's less likely that person is going to act out in order to get your attention. The idea is that it doesn't need to because he's getting it anyway. What you have to do is, first of all, collect some data. You know how to collect data now. So get some baseline data on how often the problem behavior occurs. Then take the period of time in which you collected data. Let's say that you did this in a class period that was 1 hour. And let's say that the behavior occurred 6 times on average during that hour. What you have to calculate is something called the inter-response interval. That's the average amount of time between the occurrences of a behavior. So if you take 6 incidents of behavior occurring in 60 minutes, so you're dividing 60 minutes by 6, obviously that's 10 minutes as your inter-response interval. So for that student, you would want to give some attention at least once every 10 minutes. Over time, you might want to thin that out. Of course, 6 times in an hour is not a whole lot of attention. It's more likely that the kid's going to be doing something more frequently. I observed a kindergarten kid about 3 weeks ago, and he had a reinforcement program that had been developed for him. He was supposed to go an entire day and not have any problems, and he could earn something. That obviously wasn't working. That's why I was there. What I saw was about every 8 or 10 minutes, he would approach the teacher in some way and check in with her. And at times when he wasn't doing that, he would push another student or push over a table or knock over materials, and the teacher would come and intervene. In other words, he very clearly was doing something to get the teacher's attention about every 8 minutes. So my recommendation to them was that their reinforcement plan had to allow him to earn attention from the teacher at least once every 8 minutes, or it simply wasn't going to work. There's no way that he would delay an entire day. Now, you might get there over time, but that's not where the student is right now. The PREMAC principle, I actually think I deleted this from the PowerPoint that you've got on here, but I'll explain it briefly. We'll come back to it later, though, but it's the idea that if you're asking a student to do something that he or she doesn't really like to do, you can use an activity that's more highly preferred as a reinforcer. We call it Grandma's rule because, remember, Grandma used to say, if you want some apple pie, eat all your peas. So that's what PREMAC is basically, but we'll talk more about it later. Some antecedent strategies are more related to instruction, and others have to do with the way in which we interact with students. The Scott chapter covers each of these pretty well, so you may want to refer back to that chapter if you have any questions about these, but hopefully you read it first. Pre-correction is a simple reminder to the student about what behavior is expected. You do it in situations where you think the student is likely to have a problem, but you do it before a problem occurs. Now, we talked about this with proactive strategies, but for individual students, these are going to be more individualized interventions. For example, if you teach a student a coping skill, or if you teach a student a way to respond more appropriately to being teased, remind the student of that skill before he or she goes into a situation where he or she is likely to be teased. Offering choices can be an effective part of an intervention. Some people get carried away with this and offer kids, too many choices. Sometimes that can create problems too, but offering 2 or 3 choices in a lot of situations can be very helpful. I actually find this to be very effective with kids with emotional behavioral disorders who are having some difficulties. If a kid is having some problems, I might approach a student and say, this is not acceptable, but you can do this or you can do this. Decide what you're going to do and take care of it. So giving choices ways as to how to solve a problem gives them more responsibility. We'll spend more time talking about that later as well. Sometimes just giving students some help or assistance in a difficult situation can be an effective intervention. The key there is not giving too much help so that you're making the student dependent on you, but at the same time giving enough that you're going to prevent the student from becoming so frustrated as to engage in some problem behavior to it. One of my favorite ones called behavioral momentum, or if you want to get fancy, high probability request or interspersed request. This is something that can help you out in a difficult situation. It's not something that's a long-term solution, but it does come in handy sometimes. The idea is this. If there's something that a student is very unlikely to do, and you know that if you give the student that request, he or she's not going to follow it, the likelihood of the student following your request can be significantly increased if you do the following. Get the student's attention. Give them a sequence of 3 or 4 requests that the student's very likely to follow. Even something like, John, would you look at me, please? Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so you give the direction. When the student follows it, you immediately reinforce them. You do this in a rapid sequence. I often am asked to go into schools and look at kids that I really don't know. They don't know me. They don't have any history with me. So it's not real likely they're going to just follow my directions. So I use this a lot. Not too long ago, I was working with a kid who was a young man with autism. He was about 6 years old. He was having a lot of difficulty. I gave him a series of requests, and I got him to go to different places in the room with me. What the people in the classroom wanted him to do was sit down at a table and finish some work that he had started, and he had pushed the table over, and they were trying to get him to go back, and he was falling on the floor and trying to bite him. So rather than trying to get him to immediately go back there, which I thought would have been real difficult and gotten him more upset, I had him go to the other side of the room, and I asked him to help me put some things away. It had nothing to do with what he had just done, and he actually did that. I gave him some reinforcement, and I was very calm about it. And after I had given him about 4 or 5 directions, and he had followed them, then I just put my hand on his back, and I said, now let's go pick this up. We went over to the area where he pushed the table over. We picked the stuff up, and then I real calmly said, now we need to finish this. And he did. I was actually surprised that he did. It usually doesn't work that well. But again, you get better with it with practice, and like anything, it's not going to work every time, but it can be a handy tool to have in your toolbox. And this is just a cartoon example of behavioral momentum working. I thought it was funny. Task variation can be an effective strategy as well. That's simply changing more highly preferred and less preferred activities, or alternating them. So rather than give a student two tasks in a row that are not very highly preferred, mix that up, alternate it with something that's more highly preferred. I've had students that I had to do their whole schedule like that all day long, and through scheduling that creatively, I was able to get them to accomplish a lot more work. Sometimes I really have to change this graphic. I got a record player on there. Sometimes you can take an area of instruction that's really difficult for a student, or something the student really dislikes, and embed it within something that's more highly preferred. Sometimes you can also use a more highly preferred item as just a way of distracting the person. Sometimes I mix the two of those together. I was working with a young man a few years ago when I lived in Tennessee. He had autism, and he just really disliked math or anything to do with numbers. He would have tantrums anytime they would put numbers down in front of him. He really loved NASCAR, though. So I developed a set of materials for working on math that involved NASCAR. So he got to work with race cars that had numbers on them and do different kinds of activities. And I was able to get him to do his work. So the fact the cars were there, and it also it embedded it within another routine. It was something that was more for them. So my wife is a special ed teacher. She, a few years ago, was able to have her class manage a school store. And she used that as a way of working on math skills for some of the kids. So they got to count the inventory or count up the money. And it was a functional way to work on skills, but it was embedded within an activity that was helpful. Also, having students collaborate sometimes can be helpful. That was certainly the case with the school store. They got to work together. Sometimes you have to teach to be successful in working together, though. Building tolerance for delay is an important skill. We'll talk later on in the course about functional communication training, teaching students to use some kind of communication instead of a problem behavior. A piece that goes along with that is teaching kids to tolerate delays as well, because initially when we teach some kind of communication skill, you want to reinforce students for using the skill, but in the real world we don't get things we ask for right away, and we don't get them every time. So what works pretty well, and I've used this many times over the years with kids, is you teach them a cue or a signal they're almost done. So if a student, let's say you're teaching a student to ask for a break, and the student's been engaging in some kind of problem behavior to escape a demand. So you teach the student to ask for a short break instead of engaging in a problem behavior like property destruction. Initially, you want to give the student a break right away. Later on, though, you want to start introducing this delay cue. So with one young man, I would simply say, okay, you want a break? Okay, let's finish these two. Then you'll be done. So I'd have him do 2 things, then I'd have him do 3, and I would very slowly increase the time between asking for a break and actually getting a break, to the point that it was a more functional skill. It was something that he could handle if he had to wait. If you know your student's going to be in a situation where she or he has to wait, then teach them to tolerate it. You'll be glad you did when you encounter something like on a community trip and the kid has to wait, and it's very useful. So if you know it's going to be a problem, plan for it. We talked about predictability before. For some students, it's much more important than others. For kids with autism spectrum, for instance, predictability is essential. They need to be able to anticipate what's going to happen next, to the point that, not being able to do so would be a big problem. Picture schedules are very effective. You can do something fancy or with electronic. There's a picture scheduler app for an iPad or an iPod if someone has one, but just simple pictures with Velcro work extremely well. Those have been working for years. They're very inexpensive.